Few men loom larger in the public mind than Robert E. Lee. The last of Plutarch's men in America, he stands over the stage of history like a tremendous stone statue of olden days, sitting atop the American Olympus as the Marble Man. An immaculate, almost inhuman paragon of virtue, a man defined by his supreme personal excellence and flawless self-command. We picture him sitting atop his gray charger beneath the Virginia oaks, a gray-bearded patriarch whose dignity was never ruffled by the chaos of the battlefield, whose speech was never corrupted by profanity, and whose conduct was governed by a clockwork, near-religious adherence to duty. To an incredible extent, this is indeed who Robert E. Lee was and what he was like. Yet this legendary man of marble was not born into all of the aristocratic privilege one might expect given his noble name, Norman lineage, and status as one of the men who most defined American aristocratic excellence, along with other such demigods as George Washington and Teddy Roosevelt. Young Robert E. Lee, in fact, did not begin his life as one of those unblemished icons of the Southern gentry. Rather, he was an initially unwanted child of a family in steep and painful decline, the last son of a dissolving dynasty racing towards financial collapse as it became known for moral wreckage. As we covered in our episode on the downfall of Light Horse Harry Lee, the man who sits toward the top of the American pantheon and at the absolute summit of the Southern pantheon was born amidst whispers of shame in a cold, drafty room in a house as crumbling as the family that resided within it. But this did not ruin the man who would emerge. The last Lee son of Stratford, the consummate Virginia aristocrat of later days, became great not just in spite of, but because of these circumstances and the rotten men of his family's recent past, from the dissipated Light Horse Harry to the disgraceful Black Horse Harry, as we covered in that recent episode. Indeed, every defining pillar of Robert E. Lee's soul, his rigid, lifelong exactitude, his dread of personal debt, his emotional self-restraint, and his quiet, self-denying submission to God and authority, was forged as a deliberate, near-obsessive psychological reaction against the sins of the men who came before him. Such is what we covered last time in the episode on his mother. That attitude was one forged when he was but a young lad and solidified as he became a young man. As we will talk about in this show, Robert spent his youth consciously becoming something different and greater than the dissipated, erratic ghosts of his recent bloodline, becoming a man instead more like the greatest version of his earlier forefathers. We will trace the formative years of Robert E. Lee, that early crucible that made him the man that he is remembered as being. Following his journey from the gloomy place of his birth, the decaying ruins of Stratford Hall, to his childhood on the cobblestone streets of Alexandria, where he grew up in the shadow of George Washington's memory while serving as his sick mother's devoted and caring son. We'll track his meticulous academic preparation under local schoolmasters, his assault on the halls of Congress to secure a cadet's warrant, and his 4 grueling, immaculate years on the bluffs of the Hudson River at West Point, where he not only survived the difficult regime of Sylvanus there, but graduated without a single mark of demerit. Finally, we'll show the bittersweet zenith of his youth as the newly commissioned lieutenant rushed from the parade grounds at West Point to the deathbed of the mother who had made him, closing the first great chapter of a life that was forged in the furnace of duty. The world into which Robert Edward Lee was ushered in on January 19th, 1807, was that of a declining, decrepit Stratford Hall. Perched upon the high clay bluffs overlooking the lower Potomac River in Westmoreland County, Stratford was one of the most imposing brick citadels in North America. Built in the shape of a grand H, it was a fortress constructed by his great-uncle, Thomas Lee, in the 1730s, as we covered in our episode on Thomas's life, and the mansion had served for generations as the political and economic capital of the Lee dynasty. But by the winter of 1807, Stratford Hall was no longer a palace of baronial hospitality in the best tradition of the Virginia gentry, as it had once been under Thomas and Philip Ludwell Lee. nor was it any longer the seat of a thriving dynasty. It was instead a cold, decaying, and creditor-haunted prison. Its master, Light Horse Harry Lee, was in his final, desperate throes of financial collapse, having squandered not only his fortune, but as much as he could of the fortunes of both Matilda Lee and Anne Hill Carter Lee, his first and second wives. And so the crying baby was born into a drafty and furniture-devoid house surrounded by sheriffs and process servers hounding his indebted father, who hid behind the doors of Stratford, which he had secured with heavy iron chains and thick oak bars. Giving birth to him was the once happy heiress and now exhausted mother and soon-to-be deserted wife, Anne Hill Carter Lee. Born to the opulent luxury and gentle society of Shirley Plantation on the James River, one of the great seats of the Carter clan, Anne had seen Harry destroy their family's wealth with his speculations. Sickly, suffering from the early stages of chronic pulmonary tuberculosis, and shattered by her husband's infidelity and recklessness, Anne spent the bitter winter of 1806 huddling over a small charcoal brazier in the corner of the cavernous Great Hall of Stratford. When Anne discovered that she was pregnant with her fifth child, she had fallen into a deep, agonizing despair. In private and painful confessions to her closest family members, Anne admitted that this child was unwanted. To bring another infant into a household besieged by bailiffs, living in freezing rooms, hovering on the brink of real penury, seemed to her sensitive soul to be an unbearable cruelty. She carried the child through the dark autumn of 1806 with a heavy heart, viewing her pregnancy as the latest affliction in what had become a life of unremitting sorrow, more or less since she had married Light Horse Harry. And then in early January 1807, returning from a visit to her family at Shirley, Anne endured a freezing, multi-day carriage ride through the howling winter. She arrived at Stratford feverish, shivering, racked by a violent cough. Within days, she went into difficult, agonizing labor. So this was the setting of the birth, and it reflected the bleak reality of the Lee family's decline. Stratford was so short of firewood and domestic help that only a single hearth was kept burning in the whole mansion. The fireplace in the drafty, bare, east bedchamber on the elevated main floor of the house. It was a room steeped in dynastic history. Within these very walls, decades earlier, two signers of the Declaration of Independence, Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, men we have covered individually and covered together in our episode on the Lee brothers, had drawn their first breaths. And there, on the freezing night of January 19th, 1807, amidst the howling winds of the Potomac, Anne Carter Lee gave birth to a healthy, robust baby boy. She named him Robert Edward, honoring the two beloved Carter brothers whose trusteeship of the trust her father had left her protected her modest inheritance from her husband and his hounding creditors. This infant, though dreaded by his mother when in the womb, turned into something of a healing balm to his mother's wounded spirit. He was a beautiful, dark-eyed child of exceptional sweetness and calm, crying little and gazing up at his mother with a quiet, steady serenity. From that first freezing night in the east chamber of the decaying mansion home, an extraordinary attachment formed between the fragile mother and her youngest boy. As Burton J. Hendrick puts it in his The Lees of Virginia, quote, "As not infrequently happens with unwanted children, Robert presently became his mother's inseparable companion and the chief comfort of her life. It is no wonder the child was so handsome and sweet-tempered. Some have held that Robert E. Lee was a Carter, not a Lee, and certainly in temperament, in character, in method, in sense of responsibility, in habit of mind and taste, always accepting that supreme taste for military life, the Confederate leader bore little resemblance to Light Horse Harry. In mental tranquility, in spaciousness of outlook, the man seemed more adapted to Shirley beside the James than to Stratford on the Potomac. The fact is that Robert Lee's association both with Stratford and with his father was slight. Robert's conscious memories of Stratford Hall were fleeting, shadowy, and tinged with melancholy. He would only spend the first 3 years of his life within its high brick walls, in fact. In the spring of 1809, the sheriff of Westmoreland finally trapped Light Horse Harry outside the chained doors, hauling the 53-year-old former hero off to Montrose Jail for debt. A year later, in the spring of 1810, the final blow fell. Henry Lee IV, White Horse Harry's eldest son by his first marriage, turned 21 years old. Under the terms of his mother Matilda's 1790 trust, Henry Lee IV, the infamous Black Horse Harry, asserted legal ownership of Stratford Hall, and his disgraced father, now out of jail, his stepmother Anne, and his young half-siblings left the estate. This was to Anne's taste in any case, as she had told Harry that she would wait for him outside of jail in Stratford, but once he was out of jail, they were moving. And so they moved to Alexandria. This came in the summer of 1810, when the family packed its last few belongings into personal trunks, found a carriage, and prepared to leave the Northern Neck forever. According to family legend, as the family prepared to leave, young Robert was nowhere to be found. They went back into the house to find him. There he was in the nursery room, saying goodbye to the angels molded into the fireplace, the relics of a bygone age of dignity and prosperity for the Lee family. Emery Thomas, describing Lee's departure from Stratford through the poverty of the family wrought by his father, notes, quote, "Robert Edward Lee was to the manor born. He was even in the manor, Stratford Hall, born. But at age 2, he left the manor and returned only as a guest. Indeed, Lee spent much of his life as a house guest and never owned a home in which he lived." End quote. Decades later, General Lee could recall only a single haunting image from his birthplace, the sight of his sickly, weeping mother walking out into the overgrown, neglected garden of Stratford Hall on the morning of their departure, kneeling in the dirt and planting a small horse chestnut tree as a silent, living farewell to the soil she would never see again. This doesn't, however, mean that General Lee disliked Stratford or had only sad memories of it. Indeed, he wrote in one letter after the war that he was considering trying to buy it if it was for sale and moving there and raising corn and pork. That didn't happen. He was always saying he wanted to live on a farm in the country and live a quiet life, and never really did. But in any case, he did love Stratford until his final days. But that period in his life was over, and the family turned its faces northward, settling in the city of Alexandria on the upper Potomac. The Alexandria of that day was a vibrant, thriving seaport that was characterized by its cobblestone streets, its brick warehouses, which were quite busy at the time, its bustling docks. More importantly, for the Lees, it was a community dominated by the extended kinship networks of the Virginia gentry. The Carters, the Fitzhughs, the Washingtons, Custuses. Here, sheltered by respectable cousins, Anne rented a modest 2-story red brick townhouse on Cameron Street, and later she was able to move to a handsome, comfortable residence on Orinoco Street that her Fitzhugh relative let her and her family, which was soon not to include White Horse Harry, use. Describing this Fitzhugh relationship and its importance to the Lee family, Margaret Sanborn notes, quote, "The kinfolk with whom she, meaning Anne, and her children were destined to be on the most intimate lifelong terms were William Henry Fitzhugh and the beautiful girl he married in 1814, Anna Maria Goldsborough, who, it was said, was fit to grace a throne. The Fitzhughs divided their time between their country estate, Ravensworth in nearby Fairfax County, and a townhouse on the east side of Washington Street near Queen. They admired Anne for managing so well in adversity and for keeping her dignity and cheerfulness." End quote. In Alexandria, young Robert grew up in the shadow of George Washington. The great general had been the patron saint of the town. In effect, he had surveyed its streets, served as a town trustee, worshipped at Christ Church, maintained his town office on Cameron Street, and drilled the local militia on the Market Green. The stories of Washington's integrity, his physical majesty, his self-discipline, and his devotion to the American Republic were the daily bread of Robert's childhood. Bounded by the shame of his father, young Robert instinctively adopted the father of the country as his supreme model as a man and developed a lifelong reverent obsession with the Washington standard of conduct. This was only to be strengthened with his later marriage in connection with the Washingtons and Custis family through that, but more on that in the future. In the spring of 1813, when Robert was 6 years old, his father, Light Horse Harry, returned from the 1812 Baltimore riot, which had to do with the War of 1812, as a disfigured, crippled, and broken invalid. Tormented by constant pain, hounded anew by his creditors, unable to endure his fallen status in Virginia, the old general walked down to the Alexandria wharves in May 1813, boarded a vessel down for the West Indies, and abandoned his family, including young Robert, forever. He would wander through the Caribbean islands for 5 years as a threadbare pauper, dying in exile on Cumberland Island, Georgia, in 1818. Robert E. Lee would never look upon his father's face again. With the patriarch gone, the full burden of managing the family fell upon Anne Carter Lee, whose health was rapidly collapsing under the relentless advance of tuberculosis and the general stress of her life. Simultaneously, Robert's older brothers were leaving the household. Charles Carter Lee, the eldest, was sent north to Harvard University to study law. His time there was mainly remarkable in Lee family history because he spent too much money. While Sidney Smith Lee entered the United States Navy as a midshipman at the age of 15 and embarked on a long career of many interesting voyages, perhaps most interesting of which was his commanding Commodore Perry's flagship when Japan was opened, as we covered in our episode on the Lees of Lee, Sylvania. In any case, at the tender age of 11, young Robert Edward Lee had to step into the void that was increasingly left by his family departing and his father's failures, and he became the primary domestic manager, financial steward, and nurse for his invalid mother. While other boys of the Virginia gentry in Alexandria, a spot to which many families were heading as they embarked upon professional careers and left the infertile, overfarmed soil of the old plantations behind, were spending their afternoons riding horses for sport or lounging in taverns, Robert lived a life of adult responsibility. It's a quite severe life, in fact. He carried the brass ring with the family keys hooked to his belt. He unlocked the pantry stores, measured out items in it like flour, sugar, tea. Every morning, with a wicker basket over his arm, the slender, handsome boy walked to the Alexandria market stalls, negotiated with butchers, compared prices, bought the food for the family, and recorded every single penny of expenditure in his mother's neat household ledger books. This was to become a habit of his life. Robert became his mother's shadow and her protector. He mixed her daily medicines, he measured out her drops of laudanum, and he tended to her during her terrifying bouts of fever and coughing. When the sun broke through the clouds, Robert would walk into Anne's bedchamber, gently lift her frail and emaciated body in his strong arms, carry her down the steep stairs to her carriage. He would arrange her quilts and pillows, prop her up to protect her lungs from the damp air, take her for a ride. To shield her from the drafty winds that whistled through the carriage doors, Robert would pull out the pocket knife he carried with him, take sheets of thick wrapping paper, and cut elaborate, decorative paper curtains to wedge into the window cracks, keep her warm. As he drove the carriage slowly through the rolling fields of Fairfax County, he would deploy his warm and playful wit, telling amusing stories and cracking gentle jokes to make his melancholy mother smile. He still had his fun as a boy and a young man, to be sure, playing games with the other kids, hopping in the river for a swim, and so on. As Margaret Sanborn points out in her biography of him, many of the recollections that add those little details about his life as a young man, the buying of the groceries, the mixing of the medicine, the carriage rides, all that, come from when he was an older teen, soon to be bound for West Point. But still, the recollections from those who saw him as he grew up were that he was always bound by a dutiful and tender affection for his mother and was both very caring and very detail-oriented in his management of their household. So he did have his fun. He was always, appropriate to his age in terms of doing things a young boy does. He wasn't really a demigod, even if he seems like it. But he was special, and he did do these things. It's not all entirely a myth or based on incorrectly applied recollections. As Emery Thomas puts it, describing Lee's attachment to his duty and its connection to his choice of career, quote, Robert Lee became a righteous young man. He assumed male responsibilities for the household while still an adolescent. He endured the discipline and rigor of West Point without incurring a single demerit. He embarked upon a career as an engineer officer and pursued public works within a military establishment that most often rewarded diligence ahead of brilliance, end quote. And despite these heavy domestic burdens, Robert was far from being a sickly or reclusive child. He possessed a robust, magnificent physical constitution, which he had inherited from the athletic stock of both the Carters and the Lees. And so he was able to live an active outdoor boyhood when not helping his mother, doing all the fun things along the banks of the Potomac. He swam in the wide river currents, he fished for perch and rockfish, hunted wild ducks in the marshes and meadows of King George County. He was a fearless, natural horseman who could judge horses and horse flesh with an expert eye. He spent many hours in the saddle, exploring the woods around Alexandria, and he developed an extraordinary physical stamina that astounded his playmates. Contemporaries recalled that young Robert could run for miles through the Virginia fields without stopping or showing the slightest sign of breathlessness. In this physical excellence, he's quite similar to George Washington, who also had these stories told about him when he was an adolescent young man. Alongside his physical development, Robert pursued a rigorous classical education with the help of his mother and family, of course. His early schooling took place at Eastern View in Fauquier County, a small, select family academy operated on the estate of his Carter cousins. The Virginia gentry built schools for their kids and their relations and hired the best tutors, at least the best tutors that could be afforded for them. And so Robert was very fortunate, and the Carters were better with money than his father and could afford to keep this practice up. He appears to have gotten a solid educational foundation at this Carter school to which he went as a boy. And it was to more than school that young Robert went as he traveled the countryside and saw his Carter cousins as an adolescent young man. His time with his cousins was also time of revelry with fellow, though more prosperous, members of the Virginia gentry, and time in which he learned to use his physical and constitutional advantages to his benefit. As Gib Kerr puts it in his book, Uncancel Robert E. Lee, quote, Robert E. Lee grew up visiting cousins on prosperous estates in the beautiful Virginia countryside. He was a Lee and a Carter, with wealthy and influential relatives and famous ancestors, including 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence. Yet he himself hailed from much more humble circumstances. He must have felt like somewhat of an outsider in their midst, and unable to impress them with his wealth, he learned to use what tools he had: good looks, charm, dignity of bearing, and, later, impeccable character. Kinship was of the utmost importance to Virginians in those days. Young Robert delighted in the company of his vast network of cousins throughout the Old Dominion. He came to know them well, not only from frequent visits to the far-flung family estates, but as a young boy at the family school for the young Carter progeny at Eastern View, the home of Lee's aunt, Elizabeth Carter Randolph, in Fauquier County. End quote. Douglas Southall Freeman, writing how this shaped young Robert in Volume 1 of his Robert E. Lee notes, or R.E. Lee notes, quote, the prime family characteristic of geniality and friendliness seemed to be accentuated with each new generation. The size and endogamy of the Carter tribe made it socially self-contained. Every true Carter liked everybody, but most of all he liked his kinspeople. Often and joyfully they visited one another. Of journeying and letter writing and the exchange of family news, the years brought no end. Was it surely, amid the infectious laughter and the kindly chatter of his cousins, that the youthful Robert developed early the fondness for the company of his kin that was so marked in his maturity? While Robert instinctively adopted the social attitude of the Carters, he was too young to observe in childhood, if indeed he ever realized this most remarkable fact about his mother's family. The males of the Carter stock did not often aspire to public life or shine in it, but the women of the blood of King Carter, when they married into other lines, became the mothers and grandmothers of a most extraordinary number of distinguished men. End quote. So the young man learned not only his letters and his math, but how to comport himself well, and do so in a way that would be a credit to his ancestors on both sides of his family. In 1820, at the age of 13, Robert entered the prestigious Alexandria Academy, situated in a solid brick building on Washington Street. The academy had been endowed by George Washington himself and was presided over by a formidable, highly learned classical scholar named William B. Leary. For 3 years of academic rigor and intensity, from 1820 to 1823, Master Leary subjected young Robert to a demanding curriculum grounded in advanced mathematics and the classical languages. Robert actually thrived in this disciplined academic environment, and it was to serve him well at West Point, particularly the mathematics. He read deeply of the original Greek and Latin texts, translated Homer's Iliad, Longinus's On the Sublime, the Orations of Cicero, and the imperial histories of Tacitus. Under Leary's strict tutelage, Robert absorbed the Stoic philosophy of those men and their era, one that would define his adult worldview. To some extent, at least, he was, of course, a very faithful Christian for his life. He was imbued with the belief that true nobility lay in duty, self-denial, the mastery of one's passions, and the unflinching acceptance of fate. He was quite like many members of the Virginia gentry in this regard. When Robert completed his studies at the Academy in 1823, Master Leary took the unusual step of providing him with a glowing written testimonial declaring that Robert Lee was a student of extraordinary diligence, exemplary morals, and superior classical proficiency. As Robert approached his 17th birthday in the winter of 1823 to 24, he and his mother faced something of a looming crisis for his future. Under the traditional social patterns of the Virginia gentry, a young gentleman of Lee's bloodline would have looked forward to inheriting, at some point at least, a substantial landed estate, living a life of the country squire and agricultural management, while reading law at William and Mary or Princeton and doing that part-time, perhaps, or using it to build an even larger landed empire. For Robert, that traditional path of the Virginia gentleman was blocked. He had no landed inheritance. Stratford Hall belonged to his half-brother, Henry Lee IV, who was to lose it in his disgrace. Leesylvania had been sold. His mother's modest trust income was too small to support each child in adulthood and would be split up upon her death, passing primarily to his sisters. So the family had no capital to purchase a plantation or even a farm, nor did it have the capital to pay the expensive tuition required to send Robert to Harvard like his older brother Carter or enroll him in a medical college. It's unlikely Robert saw himself as succeeding in either of those occupations anyway. But still, Robert had to earn his own living. He needed a profession that would provide him with financial independence, a steady income, an honorable social standing, and a guaranteed career so long as he was diligent and dutiful, as everyone knew he would be. And he needed to do so without spending a great deal on his education. Spending nothing on his education would be preferable. There's only one institution in the United States that fulfilled all of these requirements and fit with the personality of young Robert. That was the United States Military Academy at West Point. It offered a premier world-class education in civil and military engineering, mathematics, and natural philosophy, and was completely tuition-free. Moreover, cadets received a monthly stipend from the government, which was supposed to cover their uniforms, their rations, their lodging, and graduates were immediately commissioned as officers in the regular army, which guaranteed a lifelong career in the service of the nation. Perhaps there wasn't overly much opportunity for advancement, but it was nevertheless a good career, and for a poor gentleman's son with a mathematical mind, West Point was a great prize. So Robert E. Lee chose to do that. Emery Thomas, describing this calculation in his History of Robert E. Lee, notes, quote, "The cost of further education had to be a factor in Robert's decision. If his profession required more schooling, he would have to find a patron to pay for it. He had likely seen quite enough of doctors from witnessing those who attended his mother and sister. Indeed, he avoided physicians throughout his life whenever he could do so. He was a practicing Christian, but he had never felt called to be confirmed in the Episcopal Church, and thus was an unlikely candidate for holy orders. He never believed that he could become an effective teacher, perhaps because he was shy, and besides, teaching was a very marginal profession in the 19th century. Robert's public reticence probably precluded much consideration of law. Carter was the lawyer in the family, and if his example counted for anything, the law was less than lucrative for Lee's. By process of elimination, if nothing else, Robert seemed destined to become a soldier. Light Horse Harry needed a successor on the field of Mars. And if Robert could secure an appointment to the United States Military Academy, then his education would be free. His obligation would be 5 years, That included his 4 years at West Point. The academy taught engineering, maybe not yet the best engineering in the country, but definitely good enough. If Robert found Army life distasteful, he would have an alternate career, end quote. So, in February 1824, 17-year-old Robert launched a personal campaign to secure a cadet appointment. Because appointments were fiercely contested and controlled entirely by the Secretary of War in the end, Robert traveled across the Potomac to Washington, D.C. to press his case in person. Dressed in his finest suit of clothes, the tall, exceptionally handsome teenager walked into the War Department and secured an interview with the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun was deeply impressed by the young Virginian in every way, from his striking appearance to his dignified speech and bearing. That was a good start for getting the appointment. Meanwhile, Robert's extended family network went to work. Letters of recommendation poured into the War Department from prominent political figures across the South. His kinsman, Virginia Congressman Robert S. Garnett, wrote a passionate endorsement. Family friends secured letters from influential senators, and family lore long held that even General Andrew Jackson, an old ally of his father, added his weight to the application. The family shamelessly and effectively leveraged the Revolutionary War glory of Light Horse Harry Lee, presenting young Robert as the worthy heir to a great martial legacy. The campaign was a triumph, but it encountered an immediate administrative delay. Because West Point was inundated with a massive backlog of applicants, Calhoun informed Robert that all appointments for the entering class of 1824 were already filled. Robert was granted a formal warrant for the class entering in the summer of 1825. Faced with a full 16-month waiting period before he could report to the Hudson, Robert enrolled in a specialized preparatory school in Alexandria operated by Benjamin Hallowell, a renowned educator and master mathematician. This was to prove most advantageous for young Robert. And I noticed I misspoke. Andrew Jackson was an ally of his half-brother, Dark Horse Harry, not really of his father. Sorry for misspeaking. Hallowell's school, located on Washington Street, adjacent to the Lee home on Orinoco, was famous for its rigorous instruction in advanced algebra, geometry, and trigonometry. Hallowell was immediately struck by the young Virginian's extraordinary habits of mind. In his personal memoirs, the schoolmaster left behind a vivid, unforgettable portrait of the 18-year-old Robert, writing, quote, "He was a most exemplary student in every respect. He was never behind time in his attendance, was always thoroughly prepared for his recitations, and never had an imperfect lesson. He was remarkably fond of mathematics, and in drawing his diagrams on the slate, they were so neat, accurate, and finished that they resembled fine copperplate engravings rather than ordinary chalk drawings." This obsessive, near-religious dedication to precision and order was the hallmark of Robert's mind, bearing, and life. While other boys rushed through their math problems with messy scribbles, Robert carefully ruled his lines, measured his angles down to the millimeter, and presented his pristine proofs. He was already training himself to be a military engineer. In June 1825, the long-awaited orders arrived from the War Department, commanding Cadet Robert E. Lee to report to West Point by July 1st. The leave-taking from Alexandria was a scene of profound emotion. Anne Carter Lee's health had declined severely. She was weak, bedridden, cough-racked, fully aware that she might not live to see her son ever again, probably not to complete his 4-year academy course. Robert was her favorite child, her nurse, her daily companion. As the 18-year-old packed his leather trunk, strapped on his traveling coat, his mother broke down in uncontrollable weeping. Clinging to her boy's neck, the invalid mother cried out to her kinswomen with words that echoed through the family for generations. "How can I live without Robert? He is both son and daughter to me." Tearing himself gently from her arms, Robert walked down the steps of the Orinoco Street house, climbed into the stagecoach, and began his journey north towards the Hudson Highlands. He was carrying with him the hopes of his mother, the burden of a tarnished name, and an unbending determination to achieve excellence at the military academy. He wouldn't be back in Virginia for 2 years. In the closing days of June 1825, 18-year-old Robert E. Lee stood on the wooden deck of a Hudson River steamboat as it churned its way northward through the dramatic, mist-shrouded highlands of New York. Rounding a sharp bend in the river, the boat approached a high, rocky granite promontory, jutting boldly into the current. West Point. Stepping onto the wharf and climbing the steep, winding path to the elevated plain, Cadet Lee entered a Spartan and severe military world. West Point was in the midst of a profound transformation under the superintendency of Lieutenant Colonel Sylvanus Thayer, revered as the father of the military academy. Thayer had systematically eliminated the nepotism, drunkenness, and general laxity that had plagued the early academy, replacing them with a merciless system of discipline. The daily routine was grueling in the extreme. Cadets were woken at dawn, followed by hours of rigid, close-order drill on the rocky plain, exhausting artillery and cavalry exercises, and intense academic recitations at the blackboard that lasted for hours at a time. Cadets lived in drafty, unheated stone barracks. If they weren't in tents on the plain, they slept on thin mattresses laid out upon the bare floorboards. They were subjected to relentless surprise inspections of their uniforms, their muskets, their quarters. Many of the most famous figures in 19th century American history rebelled with fury against this crushing, suffocating regimentation. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi was court-martialed and nearly expelled for participating in the notorious Eggnog Riot and sneaking out of barracks to drink whiskey at Benny Haven's Off-Limits Tavern. William Tecumseh Sherman racked up hundreds of demerits for disorderly rooms, smuggled food, late roll calls. A brilliant young cadet named Edgar Allan Poe threw off his uniform, neglected his duty, and was drummed out of the academy for desertion. He didn't do well there. Cadet Robert E. Lee took a different path. While others rebelled, Robert, in a characteristic of his life, submitted, going along with their system and doing so with what amounted to perfection. Over the course of his 4 grueling years at West Point, through more than 1,400 daily inspections, hundreds of guard mounts, unannounced barrack searches, Cadet Lee did not receive a single mark of demerit. His white cross belts and trousers were praised by inspecting officers as white as the driven snow. His brass plates, buttons, bayonet scabbard gleamed like polished mirrors. His barracks room was always immaculate. Perfection. He never missed a roll call, neglected a guard tour, uttered an insubordinate word. He constructed a record of spotless compliance, a feat achieved by only a tiny handful of cadets in the entire history of the United States Military Academy. In later decades, popular myth and early biographers claimed that his fellow cadets nicknamed him the Marble Model out of sarcasm and being disgruntled with his perfection. However, an examination of contemporary letters, cadet diaries, academic records, academy records reveal that this famous moniker was something of a myth, at least as originally construed. Robert was not called the Marble Model by his classmates in the 1820s. That was a title bestowed on him 30 years later in the 1850s by the young cadets who served under him when he returned to West Point as superintendent and looked upon him. At this point, he was graying, stately, a real man remarkable for his majesty, as a living statue, a man of complete military rectitude. They meant it positively. In the 1820s, his classmates saw a different young man. Cadet Lee was perfect, but he was widely admired, and he wasn't seen as a cold or sanctimonious prig, but as the most handsome, athletic, genuinely popular gentleman in the Corps. He was perfect without being hated, and indeed was widely admired. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, a narrow waist, dark brown hair, striking, expressive eyes, Robert was a physical marvel. His close classmate, lifelong friend, Joseph E. Johnston, recalled that Robert was universally loved for his warm, genial disposition. Johnston noted that Robert was fond of conversation, enjoyed jokes, took pleasure in the company of pretty girls, immense pleasure, in fact, at the weekend hops, and never displayed the slightest hint of moral superiority over cadets who struggled with the rules and got demerits. Robert's perfection was effortless, was natural, and quiet. He didn't just preach discipline and act like one of those people, a prig, as Sanborn called him. He simply lived it. Academically, Robert was a titan. In a curriculum that was heavily dominated by mathematics, engineering, French, chemistry, and physics, Robert consistently placed among the top 5 distinguished cadets of his class. His performance at the blackboard was legendary. He could solve the complex equations and draw elaborate fortification plans with the same cool copperplate precision he had learned under Master Hallowell. Those months of rigorous preparation had helped him immensely. Describing how this personal and mental excellence shaped how Robert's classmates at the Academy viewed him, H.W. Crocker, in his Robert E. Lee on Leadership, notes that the Marble Man myth is convincing not, quote, because he was cold, but because he was perfect, the handsomest man in his class, with a graceful, athletic body built on an expansive chest that tapered like an inverted pyramid, down to miniature, size 4.5 feet. He graduated without a single demerit on his record, second in his class academically, and was noted for his dignified but easy manner. He was the very personification of the gentlemanly ideal and of a leader, the sort of man others instinctively looked to for guidance and naturally followed. End quote. Indeed, as Freeman notes in his biography of Lee, a fellow cadet of his testified years afterward, quote, his personal appearance surpassed in manly beauty that of any cadet in the Corps. Though firm in his position and perfectly erect, he had none of the stiffness so often assumed by men who affect to be very strict in their ideas of what is military. His limbs, beautiful and symmetrical, looked as though they had come from the turning lathe. His step was elastic, as if he spurned the ground upon which he trod. End quote. His academic excellence was so pronounced that the Academy hired him during his upper-class years as an acting assistant professor of mathematics, paying him a small additional stipend to teach lower-classmen. This proved most useful, given his family's poverty. By his final year, Thayer formally bestowed upon Robert the highest, most coveted honor at the military academy, at least that was available to a cadet. He was appointed adjutant of the Corps of Cadets. As adjutant, Cadet Lee was the commander of the student battalion, standing at the center of the parade ground during evening dress parade, sword drawn, reading the orders of the day to the assembled corps in a clear, resonant voice. The poor gentleman from Alexandria had become the king of his class on the Hudson Plain. As the class of 1829 entered its final academic term at the spring of that year, the competition for the top academic honors reached a gentlemanly but nevertheless fierce intensity. Throughout his 4 years, Robert had been locked in a close, brilliant academic rivalry with his classmate Charles Mason of New York. Mason was an intellectual powerhouse, a brilliant scholar who would eventually become Chief Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court and United States Commissioner of Patents. In every academic subject, from natural philosophy to French, Mason had consistently held the narrowest edge over Lee. Yet, in his final year, as the curriculum shifted into advanced civil and military engineering, artillery science, infantry tactics, Robert's genius asserted itself. In the January examinations of 1829, Robert executed a stunning academic coup. In the grueling multi-day examination on advanced military engineering and field fortifications, Robert tied for first place with Cadet Catharinus Buckingham, besting his invincible rival Charles Mason for the first time in his academy career. He was recognized by the academic board as the finest practical engineer and tactician in the class. On July 1st, 1829, the graduation ceremonies were celebrated on the West Point Plain. The class of 1829, which had begun with over 100 hopeful young men in 1825, had been whittled down by Thayer's iron sieve to just 46 graduating cadets. Robert E. Lee stepped forward to receive his diploma, graduating second in his class. He stood first in infantry tactics, first in artillery science, second in engineering, and second in conduct, with a grand total of 0 demerits across 4 years. By virtue of his high-class standing, 22-year-old Lieutenant Lee was awarded a coveted commission in the Corps of Engineers, the elite of the day, the most premier, prestigious branch of the United States Army, reserved exclusively for the top graduates of the Academy. Robert's graduation was also a triumph of personal financial discipline. While other cadets finished their 4 years deeply in debt to local tailors and tavern keepers, Robert had lived a simple life of frugality, while still always looking fabulously attired. Clothes and Their proper tailoring was something he would always spend money on throughout his life, one of the few things like that. By saving his meager cadet pay as much as possible and husbanding the small stipends earned from his tutoring, Lieutenant Lee walked down to the West Point steamboat wharf with a rare, clean account book. In fact, he boasted a positive cash balance of $103.58, over 5 ounces of gold in those days. Very impressive for a young man. Most cadets finished in debt. Very few finished with anything approaching a positive balance, much less one that large. He had entered West Point as a penniless boy. He left it as an independent officer, an elite engineer, and a man beholden to no creditor. You can see how even at this early age, he was rebuking the sins of his father. Yet, at this moment of triumph, the dark tragedy of his family life reached out once again and claimed him. Arriving in Virginia for his coveted graduation furlough, Robert received devastating news. His mother, who he had seen a couple years before during the summer, gone on carriage rides with her, visited family, been a dashing young man with his mother, her tuberculosis had entered its terminal fatal stage. Anne Hill Carter Lee was too weak to remain in Alexandria, and she had been moved to Ravensworth, the grand country plantation of her wealthy Fitzhugh cousins in Fairfax County, to be cared for in her final days. Throwing aside his new engineer's uniform, Lieutenant Lee mounted his horse and rode frantically across northern Virginia, arriving at the gates of Ravensworth to take up his post in his mother's sick room. The next 4 weeks, through the sweltering, oppressive heat of July 1829, the young officer, who should have been celebrating his glorious triumph as a dashing young graduate, the beau ideal for all the belles to dance with, became his mother's full-time, round-the-clock nurse. He refused to leave her side. He sat on a low chair beside her 4-poster bed, holding her frail, feverish hand, wiping the sweat from her forehead, measuring out her medicine, gently lifting her emaciated body to turn her pillows and ease her labored breathing. Witnesses who entered the quiet sick room left behind touching accounts of those final days. Anne was often too weak to speak, but her dark eyes, bright with fever, followed Robert with an intense, radiant love whenever he moved across the floor. She was calm, peaceful, content only when she felt the strong, gentle hand of her son resting upon her own. On July 26, 1829, Anne drew her final, shallow breath, dying peacefully in the arms of the young lieutenant she had raised. She was 56 years old. Her long, painful journey was ended, and Robert, weeping over her body, closed the eyes of the woman who had been the compass and anchor of his life, the woman who had built him and built his character, which was already famous, already renowned, already recognized. Much that is more exciting is to come in our telling of the life of General Robert E. Lee. His meticulous engineering works along the Mississippi River, his brilliant reconnaissance trails through the lava beds of Mexico, his iron nerve during the 7 Days battles, and his calm, majestic dignity in the parlor at Appomattox. In all this, it's easy to see only the soldier, but one must know how he was raised and what example he sought to set to fully appreciate him in all of those moments. Beneath the uniform and the fame beat the heart of the boy who had been raised in the shadow of infamy by a mother who through her every action taught him of duty, self-mastery, and faith in God despite many travails. His near obsessiveness with cleanliness, his strict punctuality, his meticulous financial ledgers that balanced down to the last penny, his horror of debt, his quiet, self-denying Christian humility were not accidental traits. They were how he shielded himself from the ghosts of Light Horse Harry and Black Horse Harry, and did as his mother taught him. His character had been forged early and stuck with him all his life. Now we'll get to see how that shaped him, from his time as an engineer to his service as Washington College's president, his life in the U.S. Army to his commandership of the Confederate forces. All of that soon to come over the next few shows. So stay tuned. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. I do appreciate it. Since you are listening to this and you've made it to the end, I would very much appreciate it if you shared this episode with people you think might be interested. Send them the link. It takes a second. It's how we grow. It's how we keep the show going. It's how we get new people to find it. Please leave it a like, leave a comment. I really would appreciate it. So thank you again. I'll see you again next time. Bye.